Financial Planning Summit for 2020. I thought I'd start the conference by looking at how advisors can emerge from the COVID pandemic that we're all suffering from at the moment and take charge of an ever-changing environment. I think we agree the environment is certainly changing rapidly. I'd like to, during the course of the presentation, which is more a discussion topic rather than a presentation itself, I'd like to cover three areas. I think it'd be useful if I gave some background to the current issues in UK financial services. It's going to be a very UK-centric presentation, but I do think a lot of the lessons that we're learning over here will apply to the South African market as well. So I'll give a little bit of background around the market dynamics. And then I would pose a couple of questions whether COVID has actually been a catalyst for some change, or whether that change was underway before the COVID pandemic really began to bite. I'll then look at some things that we could possibly do as advisors to cope better with the restrictions or the challenges that or perhaps even the opportunities that the pandemic gives us. And then finally, I'd like to conclude about what the determinants of success might be for those who are going to maximize the effect on their business of the current situation. So let's begin by looking at our first slide, which is what's happening in the UK advice market. And again, I've used a very brief synopsis here of some trends in the marketplace. And they're positive trends, which is good. So, if you look at the number of advisors that are active in the marketplace, giving financial services advice on investments, there are 27,557 in the last year of assessment. And as you can see, the trend is positive. The trend is moving up. So we have more advisors to service what we believe is an increasing consumer need. And they're advising profitably, which is always good for a sustained sector. So you can see that 94% of advisor firms reported making a profit in 2019. But you can see the shape changing, and the shape change is quite interesting actually from this slide. You can see that initial advice is moving down by 14% lower, and ongoing advice is moving up at 16% higher. And I'll come back later in the presentation to some of the dynamics and client needs which are affecting that change in the advice sector. So if it's changing, let's look at the next slide and see what's driving that change. And like South Africa, change is driven as much by client requirements and attitude to advice, by legislative or regulatory change. And if we look back in the UK to the RDR, which is beginning to unfurl in South Africa, then we can see back to 2012 some significant change, further augmented by the pension freedoms. So what are the key changes that have taken place over the last 7 or 8 years? Well, the first is that advice has become the product. So because of the nature of remuneration and the effective ending of commission other than in non-investment protection products, then advisors have seen advice as becoming their product rather than the product itself. And that, I think, has changed both the dynamics of advice, but also the financial metrics around the advice process. There are, and that change has been quite dramatic, quite stark, but is now the norm. We see that from the previous slide, we see that the price that people are prepared to pay for ongoing advice and interaction with their advisor is rising. Whereas in the commission world, then it was a single one-off advice mechanism which generated the revenue. There are those who say that there is an advice gap which has grown out of recent regulatory change. And I think it's easy to argue that that may be the case, because what we have seen is a gradual migration of the advice sector to higher net worth clients. As advice becomes the product, so the natural gravitation is to those people who have more disposable assets. And we have probably underserved the mass population in the UK. But I can see that that is changing. You can see that tide turning now. And that may be one of the influences of the COVID pandemic. We'll come back to that later on. Yeah. We've seen in the UK the demise, or largely the demise of the bank assurance model, which wasn't resilient enough to cope with the change between advice becoming the product and the commission structures that were enjoyed pre-RDR. And I think that that situation again is beginning to change a little bit, and we are beginning to see a little bit more of bank assurers entering the market. But two other significant things which I think have changed the way that the pandemic will impact upon advice in the future are the systemic rise of platforms. So if we look back 10 years ago, platforms were not the way that we did business, but now they very much are. And the vast majority of new business is written via a platform. And then the last regulatory change, which has really changed the way that advisors interact with their clients, was pensions freedom. So now we have a great deal of freedom in the UK about how we interact with our money in the decumulation phase. And that's really important because that makes the relationship between the advisor and their client more intimate, longer lasting, and facilitates advice becoming the product. So against this background, we face the challenges provided by the pandemic. But I hope you found it helpful to give that short insight into how the market sits at the moment. So if I move on to the next slide, the postulation I'd like to make is that COVID came along and it has changed so many aspects of so many people's lives, and particularly in financial services. However, I think there were some trends which were emerging in financial services pre-COVID, where COVID may just have become the catalyst to accelerate those changes. And if we look at this slide, I've tried to identify some of those changes. We accuse ourselves, perhaps rather harshly, of being a traditional old-style financial services business ingrained in practices of the past. And I think that was changing. I think we were beginning to embrace new technologies and new attitudes to advice. There's a demographic and generational shift of the people engaging with their money through the access of financial services. And technology and innovation has really brought around some significant changes, which may be enhanced or changed even further as a result of COVID. But I believe they were existing and quite prevalent and growing before the pandemic hit us really hard. What we have seen accelerated, I think there is no doubt, is the growth of robo/digital advice. And I think that's possibly a function of the way that people choose to interact with their money. If we think back to how people interacted, it was quite binary. You were either a self-serve client or you sought financial advice. And now I think that binary division is significantly blurred, and we have more customers who interact with their money both through digital processes, D2C, as well as take advice for critical life issues. And I think that has led to a change in the way that we think about the provision of financial services advice. We are doing more direct. We are doing more digitally. We are doing more direct ourselves as self-serve. And I think that's right, particularly in the simple product areas where we can understand the basic elements of the transaction. When we interact, we demand personalization. We don't want to interact on a faceless basis. We want to replicate some of the elements of face-to-face advice in our digital interaction. And we've become relatively sophisticated, not as sophisticated as other markets, but we're beginning to personalize that direct-to-consumer experience. We think of examples outside of financial services, and the one that obviously and most frequently springs to mind is Amazon, where, albeit a mechanized experience, we feel it personalized. We feel like people like us are interacting with Amazon, and they make recommendations which appear to be personal to us. So I think one of the significant drivers that we've seen is the move in financial services to more digital relationships. And I think the onset of COVID will accelerate, if it hasn't already, that. So on the next slide, we look at some of the robos. And one of the reasons I have difficulty with the term robo is it does actually define a series of ways of interacting with one's money. And in this slide, what I've attempted to do is to segment robos into those who are self-directed, those who offer limited investment advice, and those who offer full advice. And that's an attempt to dispel the belief that self-serve means precisely that. We serve ourselves unilaterally by interaction with a provision of the service digitally. That's not true. And we're seeing more and more blended digital advice services, where if one wants access to an advisor, a set of tools, a roadmap that helps us make our own decisions, then we can begin to see different types of digital advice emerging. Now, I'm not saying that's a function of COVID, absolutely not, but it is a function of some of the impacts that we're beginning to see accelerated as a result of the pandemic hitting. So if I move on to the next section that I identified, what I'd like to do is I'd like to perhaps examine some of the ways that COVID-19 has impacted the requirement for financial advice. And in the first slide, what I've tried to do is I've tried to look at three different impacts of COVID, because they are definitely impacts, right? So in a recent survey carried out by Next Wealth, who are a data and analytics business in the UK, right up to date, right up to 2020, you can see that a number of people, a high proportion of people, report a negative impact on their gross revenues due to COVID. Some people have experienced a short-term slowdown in new business, but we are beginning to see inquiries pick up, right? And then a relatively small number, not surprisingly, expect a positive impact as a result of COVID-19. I think we would be stretching it to expect a positive impact. So I think there is a definite impact that we've seen, but I'm not sure that the impact is going to be permanent. And you can see here, new business pipelines are being impacted. And that seems to suggest, with that 44% number there, that difficult times might not be here to stay. And I think one of the phenomenon of the COVID impact is that we assess the initial impact, but then after that, then we begin to think about how we can manage that. So there is almost a four-stage process emerging, which is kind of impact, assessment of the impact, alignment of our businesses to those impacts, and then action. And that's a logical way to approach the problem. And I think that you can see from this slide that we're beginning to see some new business opportunities emerging, or at least a different way of identifying those opportunities. You could argue, if I move on to the next slide, that these changes were forced, right? So we can see a roughly equal split between those businesses that were forced to furlough people as a result of the impact of COVID, and also those businesses that were not. At 43 and 48%, you can see it's a roughly equal split. Now, this survey was conducted quite recently, so you can see a small figure of 9% of people who were, at the time of the survey, still thinking about whether they would need to furlough people or not. But I think the interesting stat appears on the right-hand side of that slide, which is that before the impact of COVID was known, then 30% of firms were exploring ways of interacting with their clients other than traditional face-to-face models. And I think that's important for my contention that COVID may well have been a catalyst rather than something that wasn't in existence prior to beforehand. We saw great evidence in the UK of advisors beginning to think, partly driven by efficiency, but I would argue predominantly driven by a client need, that clients wanted us to interact in a different way, or at least explore different mechanisms of interacting with them. And maybe COVID has been the impact for that. And certainly in all of our professional lives, we've seen a very significant enhancement of the way that we've been forced into embracing digital communication. And this next slide shows what we all experience, which is an exponential rise in the digital interaction that we make in our day-to-day lives. And certainly as a client of a financial advisor, I have interacted digitally now for 6 months with my advisor, and I find the process, whilst new and different, took a little bit of time to get used to. I'm not saying it's the way I would want to do it forever, but it's certainly a way I'm increasingly comfortable with interacting, and I'm getting the information that I need, and any issues that I want to raise, I'm able to raise. I think this is symptomatic of, and if we move on to the next slide, you can see the argument that this is potentially symptomatic of an attitudinal shift. People were concerned about their finances pre-COVID, and COVID has probably occasioned people to be more concerned, more inquisitive, right? And I think it's particularly interesting to see that 18 to 30-year-olds, according to this stat, say they would consider getting financial advice now. Now, I haven't seen the data for this survey, but my very strong suspicion is that the awareness of matters relating to finance have been exacerbated a little by the current pandemic. So there you are. There's a kind of contention that what has been forced by the pandemic may have been bubbling under before the pandemic struck. This is an industry that constantly embraces change, not always because that change is forced upon it, but because we are beginning always to think about and challenging the different kinds of norms which have established themselves over a period of time. And my contention is COVID may be a catalyst for that. So I'd like to move on to the third stage of my presentation, or my opportunity for you to think about COVID in the context of financial services, to look at what else we can do. What else as advisors could we do to think about maximizing our business functionality during a pandemic which is likely to impact upon us for at least the foreseeable future? Now, the first contention is pretty obvious, right? Which is to look at your current tech stack. And as you can see from this slide, detailing the current stack, then I long believed that financial services is an intuitive and a personal type of engagement between ourselves and our clients. But advisory businesses now need to recognize, probably more so than ever, the positive impact that tech can have. And I guess this pandemic has forced us to look at the tech that we employ in our businesses. And you can see from the first line of this slide, or the first bar chart in this slide, right, a lack of time and a willingness to engage with tech is probably a negative feature in our industry. We don't intuitively think of technology as a way to improve either our businesses or our client relationships. But I would contend that the proliferation of tech solutions, and you can see from this slide that there don't seem to be any issues other than that of connectivity around the proliferation of tech. Now is a time for us as businesses to really embrace that tech, spend time looking at what's available and thinking carefully how what's available could be implemented in our businesses and could become a complementary part of the advice that we give, rather than just something that we think, oh my gosh, it's technology, so therefore I'll push it to the side. So my first exhortation is to ask you to consider how efficiently and effectively you use technology in your business, and whether you could benefit from the greater embracing of tech. The second area I'd like to focus on is back office processing. There is no doubt in my mind that the more efficient the back office, the more efficient the advice process, and actually the more enjoyable the client experience. When I was an advisor, I long wished for a change in the emphasis of how my day was spent. And I think now, if you're an advisor, you will always say, gosh, I spend too much time with compliance and other issues in my business. And when I used to pose a question to advisors, if you had more time or more clients, which would you choose? And inevitably people said more time. There's generally not a shortage of clients in advisory businesses, but there's definitely a shortage of time. Now, on the right-hand side of that side, you can see an encouraging trend in that if we use 40% as the benchmark, you can see in the 2 years of comparison that advisors are actually spending more than 40% of their time with their clients and less on administration. So that balance is shifting. Now, my contention is that balance will continue to shift. And one of the drivers of that is the efficient use of back office systems and back office processes. So again, a second exhortation is to think carefully about the back office systems and processes that you use. Can they be more efficient? Can they develop the relationship with the client rather than being a necessary evil? And can they allow you to spend more time with the thing that you must enjoy, and probably your clients enjoy as well, which is that interactivity, whether it be digital or face-to-face. That client time is precious time to us all. Now, one of the things that COVID has made us do is think about whether it's changes that we need to make or how other people can help us make changes. And in this next slide, what I've tried to do is I've tried to say, well, the onus of responsibility in changing the way that we operate in a pandemic doesn't necessarily exclusively rest with us. There surely is a role for platform service operators and providers to play and make our lives and provide us with tools and systems and processes which engender more efficiency. Now, the example I've used here is e-signatures. I mean, an obvious problem in the pandemic was the obtaining of wet signatures. And the alacrity with which the provider industry, admittedly in the UK, responded by allowing e-signatures is a demonstration of the fact that they're in this with us. They want to help. There are many, many other examples I could have used, but I think for those providers and in your business, I think it's right that they should be thinking about how they can help. And I also think it is right for you to be demanding for them to do things which allow the way that we need to write and do new business now. Be more efficient, be more available in the pandemic and the changes that the pandemic brings with it. I think this next slide, a quote from David Ferguson, who is the chief executive of one of the UK's largest platform service operators, it is very prescient. And it's something that I particularly have challenged myself on during this change in the way that I've had to work. And I would encourage people to do the same, because I think when we look back on 2020, it may well prove to be a time where we think more deeply about the lives that we want to lead, but more importantly for the listeners to this particular broadcast, the businesses that we want to run. So in some ways, COVID could be, again, seen as a catalyst about how we think about the businesses that we want to run, for whom we want to run them, and how we can service our clients better. Now, may I conclude by moving on to my final slide and saying what are likely to be the determinants of success? What is the low road and what is the high road? And if there's anything that can be born out of my reflections, I guess this is probably a summary. Right? I think the first bullet point is definitely an exercise in stating the blindingly obvious, but I thought I'd put it in there because we quite often forget to remind ourselves that when things are uncertain in the lives of our clients, that's the time they need us most. That's the time that we need to communicate. We need to communicate efficiently, effectively, but most important, frequently. So I think that uncertainty really demonstrates the value of what we do as financial advisors. I accept the fact in my second contention that there is work to be done on the tools and services available to financial advisors. But I think in trying to ask you to think about your tech stack and your back office systems, then I hope, right, that you can see that we're taking steps in the right direction. But now is a real opportunity for you to grasp those technological and back office enhancements and think about how you can apply them to your business so that you can deliver a better client outcome whilst at the same time delivering a more efficient financial outcome for yourselves. I genuinely believe that these new ways of working will help us at least think about and hopefully implement efficiency. I don't like the phrases that have emerged in the pandemic of new normal, because I don't think there is a clearly defined new normal. I think there are new normals for each of us listening to my words, and we will determine how our own new normal works rather than have any kind of uniform new normal. So I think, as is always the case, the low road is to resist change, is to not recognize that the world around us is changing, and therefore we need to change how we interact with that world. So I think the status quo can no longer exist, and maybe the lack of the existence of the status quo is in itself a beneficial enhancement from which we can all take some kind of comfort in times which are inherently so very difficult. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope some of the things that I've said at least provoke some thought and hopefully provoke some action. If you do want to come back to me with any particular issues or questions, I would encourage you to use the chat box, which is available on your screens, but also in the documentation that you've received, there are mechanisms for coming back to the conference sponsors. May I wish you an enjoyable remainder of conference, and thank you for listening to me.